Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with the preview to the ClassicsToday.com Insider Subscriber feature of the 10 greatest recordings of Jascha Heifetz. Now, this is really actually a fascinating topic, and I wanted to introduce it by doing a more general discussion, actually, than just Heifetz himself, and talk about artists who, well, I call them the Tiger Woods of the musical world. These are artists who raised the level, who changed the rules of the game. Because you know what happened with Tiger Woods? That is before he flamed out and became a tabloid sensation. He was just better than everybody else. And he started out, beating everybody by double-digit strokes. It was an astonishing thing. Nobody could keep up with him. Nobody could catch him. His level of play was just simply superior. But it didn't last that way because a new generation of golfers came along and the old generation practiced harder, and eventually they started catching up to him. And he wasn't going to win quite as often as he used to. He raised the level of the game. And now everybody is expected to play at a certain technical level, which is simply grander than anybody had done before in the sport. And there are certain musicians who did the same thing. Now, it's not an exact comparison, of course, because with musicians, you're dealing with that unknown quantity. It's not just technique. It's also interpretive genius, if you want to put it that way, or, sort of projection of charisma and personality in an artistic way that you don't find, in the same way in athletics, which is far more based on sheer physical ability. But there's an element of that there too. I mean, in sport too, the way you do things is as important sometimes as what you actually do. So attitude matters everywhere, and it mattered in the arts. But I want to talk about a few artists who just raised the level of the game in that way. And the first in the 19th century, and this is where it really started, where we can tell who these people were because they toured and people were in a position to hear them and acknowledge their superiority. The first was another violinist. It was Paganini, whose violin playing was of such outstanding quality that he became, people thought that Satan was, coaching him. It was that powerful. He also looked kind of sepulchral because he had gum disease and his teeth all fell out. He was sort of and very skinny and emaciated, and he couldn't talk, and but he played. And it's something else. It fascinates me looking at the history of these musicians. They endured so much misery because of the state of medicine in those days. When you read biographies of people, these musicians, and Meyerbeer's biography or all these other people, they spent their whole life, or Rossini or any of these guys, they spent their whole life in like some form of gastric distress and with chronic illnesses, and but it didn't stop them. It didn't stop them. I mean, Rossini was sick for 20 years. He really was, and it was only Olympe, his second wife, who nursed him back to health eventually, and inaugurated that Indian summer of his. So it's even the achievement in some ways is even more extraordinary. But Paganini was the transcendental virtuoso par excellence, and so powerful was his influence that he created, in a sense, by means of his example, the next one, who was Liszt. Liszt became a transcendental etude virtuoso, having witnessed Paganini. It wasn't because of what was going on in the piano world that made Liszt that kind of virtuoso. It was the example of Paganini that turned Liszt into the exemplar of what a great pianist could be. And that was, even if you don't like Liszt's music, it was an amazing example. And Liszt, the person, was just as extraordinary because he was selflessly devoted to Beethoven, to creating the piano recital, to serious musicians, to promoting every kind of music from Wagner on down. I mean, really amazing just as a person, as a personality. But as a pianist, his actual touring career was only about a decade, maybe a little bit more, but it didn't last very long before he retired and gave it up. But it was that profound that from that point on, and the works that he left, which required, of course, an astonishing virtuoso technique, and that of other pianists of the period, of course, but really Liszt more than anybody, who demonstrated that this is what a pianist had to do. And from that period on, that was the name of the game. Now, if we jump forward to the 20th century, we find we're back in the violin realm. I mean, because Liszt's reputation persisted. It persisted for generations, and his students and the people who worked with him. And so, he was still kind of the main man. And that remained pretty much unchanged for most of the 20th century until we got to the second half of the 20th century with pianists like Marc-André Hamelin, who was another one who raised the level of play. And he did it, by playing things like the Godowsky Etudes and works that no one would touch, Alcon and the Charles Ives Concord Sonata, and things that, he took what would otherwise have been specialist, obscure repertoire and returned it to the mainstream of what virtuoso pianists were expected to do. And he did it because of his technique and also because of his intelligence, his talent, and his ability to make that music sound as if it was not that hard. I mean, that doesn't mean music with a sense of struggle had no sense of struggle, but what it means is that it was something that was natural, that great pianists had to do. In the realm of opera, there was Maria Callas. Maria Callas, who returned the entire bel canto repertoire to, the mainstream of opera. It was Maria Callas who showed that what people thought was canary music, was twittering and virtuoso display, wasn't empty, that the virtuosity and the ornamentation and the coloratura had a dramatic purpose, that it could become an illustration of character. And that was her gift to the world of opera. And she was followed, of course, by Joan Sutherland, who was a very different artist, who was more voice and less, dramatic backing intelligence type thing. But again, they raised the level of technique for everybody. Marilyn Horne, of course, my God, Marilyn Horne. If it weren't for Marilyn Horne, Baroque opera would never have happened, probably. And Rossini. I mean, when you think of all this stuff, all it takes is a single artist with tremendous ability, and people sit up and take notice. So, yeah, it's happened many times. And in the 20th century, the violin avatar of that kind of performance was Heifetz. Heifetz was the exemplar of what a great violinist ought to be. And I find it fascinating. I mean, I've been going through, and we've been talking about Howard Talman's Building a Record Library, his 1953 survey of what was available in 1953. And for violin repertoire, just about the only person he recommends is Heifetz, and occasionally Milstein. But Heifetz is the guy for all of the standard repertoire, because nobody could touch him. And some people today have preferences, of course, for other violinists. Some people say, oh, it's got to be David Oistrakh, or it's got to be Szigeti, or it's got to be somebody else. And they're wonderful artists. I mean, Arthur Grumio, who I personally just adore. I really do. In fact, I like him better than Heifetz most of the time in the same repertoire, because I like the way he plays better. But, and it's unfair and very popular to dog Heifetz by saying, well, he was technically perfect, but emotionally very cool. No, he wasn't. He wasn't emotionally cool at all. It was just the opposite. He was the ultimate in high-tension violin playing. He had a fast vibrato, a somewhat febrile, isn't that the word? Febrile intensity that was just remarkable, extraordinary. The problem with Heifetz, if you could say it's a problem, with his swift tempi and constant intensity all the time, is that it lacked variety. He could become monochromatic. Some people say that's emotionally inexpressive. No, I mean, you can become, wearisome simply by virtue of the unremitting sameness of passion that you put into everything. And that was Heifetz. It really was. Now, that's a very, very gross generalization, because, Heifetz was also a violinist of uncompromising standards. As soon as he felt that his technique was slipping, he retired. I mean, he retired at the peak of his form. There is no bad Heifetz anywhere. I mean, his recordings all have the same exalted level of perfectionism. I mean, you could make little nitpicks about bits here and there because he recorded many things multiple times, but there is no violinist who's recorded history whose work sustained the same level of intensity and technical polish and consistency throughout his entire career. There isn't anybody. And it's hard to criticize perfection, I mean, in that sense. People tend to want to play it down because there's not much to talk about, is there? He was who he was, and he did what he did. And it's almost impossible to take any issue with it. But it was an extraordinary achievement. It remains an extraordinary achievement. And I think that at the end of the day, he was still the greatest violinist of the 20th century. And I think the recordings bear that out. We'll talk about more the specific recordings and what made him unique and what his weaknesses, if you want to call them that, were when we discuss the 10 greatest recording video at ClassicsToday.com, which I urge all of you to go look at if you're a subscriber. And if you're not a ClassicsToday.com subscriber, please just have a look down below. There's a link that you can explore, and I hope you'll join up because it's going to be a very interesting conversation. There's some really cool stuff, some expected and some less expected. So keep on listening, friends. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.